Good day, everyone. My name is Pedro Villarreal. I am a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, Germany. And today I would like to speak about certain legal issues related to the vaccines against COVID-19. I will focus on recent events related to the safety of one of these vaccines, namely the one manufactured by AstraZeneca. And I will begin my presentation by reminding everyone that we are gradually facing a post-vaccine world in which several vaccines against COVID-19 have received regulatory approval for their use in the population. And in the first part of this theme, of this post-vaccine world theme, I will deal with issues of civil liability in case these vaccines produce or create certain adverse health effects in persons, and how this civil liability regime lies at the public-private law intersection. Although liability the liability I will speak about is based on private law, we can only understand how liability operates during the COVID-19 pandemic for the use of these vaccines if we look at the public law framework designed for ensuring, to the maximum degree possible, of course, that such vaccines are safe for their use in the population. And let us remember that a few weeks ago, after reports of adverse events in certain persons, namely thrombosis caused by blood clots, 20 countries of the European Economic Area suspended the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine against COVID-19 for several days from the 11th of March 2021 onwards. Because all of the persons who developed such adverse events, such adverse health events, had taken the AstraZeneca vaccines a few days or weeks previous to the health event. And as of the 2nd of April, 2021, the use of the vaccine has been reinstated in most of the EEA countries, except Norway and Denmark, who have restricted further the use of the vaccine until more evidence is available. And the use of the vaccine was only partially reinstated in Sweden, Iceland, and Finland, meaning it can only be used, or it will only be used in certain groups of the population. And this is despite the fact that the European Medicines Agency had issued a statement on the 18th of March, 2021, affirming that the benefits of the vaccine outweigh the risks. But this claim means that correlation between the use of the vaccine on one hand and these adverse health events on the other hand cannot be fully ruled out yet. These risks are there, and there is no conclusive medical evidence yet determining how exactly these adverse health events may occur and in which quantities, in which proportion of the population this can be expected to occur. This evidence is not conclusive yet. And this leads us to a realization that what lies beneath these decisions by public authorities has been best expressed by a senior official at the National Institute of Public Health of Norway, who claimed that the decision to suspend the use of the vaccine was taken in light of the precautionary principle. And this principle is well known in the field of international environmental law, or environmental law generally, and basically deals with settings in which scientific evidence on the potential risks of a certain activity or in this case, a certain medicinal product scientific evidence is not conclusive on to what extent this may cause damage either to the environment, in the case of environmental law, or to the health of persons, in the case of vaccine safety. So insofar as the evidence is not conclusive, a decision must be made by public authorities on to what extent it is acceptable to undertake those risks for which there is, again, not sufficient evidence. Because on the other hand, we are dealing with a product that is necessary for protecting the population against a disease such as COVID-19. And in my talk today, I will deal with 3 sections. In the first section, I will speak about the background, the general background of regulatory issues of vaccine safety. We will look at how ensuring the safety of these medicinal products means a regulatory procedure must be undertaken in where evidence must be provided on at least a sufficient degree that can ensure that these products are safe for the population at large. Of course, the procedure cannot always offer 100% certainty on the safety of these products, but the goal is to at least meet a certain threshold in which such safety may be proven. And then I will deal with the link between vaccine safety and potential civil liability in case these medicinal products cause damage to persons, and how the link plays out in the context of a public health emergency such as COVID-19, since we are not facing ordinary procedures or an ordinary background. We will see how this also alters the usual equation regarding civil liability for potential damages caused by these medicinal products. And lastly, I will offer some conclusions on how the link between vaccine safety and liability lies in the public-private law intersection. And as a matter of general background, the guiding threads of my talk today are basically how the regulation of new medicinal products aims at striking a balance between 2 different interests, public interests. On the one hand, we have the need to protect public health from potential hazards. And this is also what the precautionary principle seeks to achieve. Since we, of course, and society has an interest in the safety of such products. And on the other side of this balance, we have the public interest to foster innovation through new products, particularly products that can prevent, treat, and cure diseases. Of course, society has a major interest in fostering the creation of these products and of pushing for access to these products. But before a medicinal product such as a vaccine is marketed, its quality, safety, and efficacy must be tested. Safety will be the focus of today, but rest assured that quality and efficacy are just as important for the public at large. And the goal of ensuring safety is to identify potential negative side effects that endanger the public or consumers in this case, since we're speaking about products. And we can understand, or this can be illustrated if we look at past examples of products, medicinal products, which were already in the market, before we had the current public law framework dealing with safety issues of medicinal products. In the past, we saw some products such as cocaine, which in the 19th century, in the second part of the 19th century, was available over the counter, meaning it did not require medical prescription, and was available for dealing with dental procedures and the pain that might have been caused by dental procedures, or toothaches in this case. And we see here the publicity from a company in the United States, in the state of New York. And another example from the 20th century, in this case, is heroin. Yes, the heroin, which was at a certain point marketed for treating the symptoms of either the common cold or a flu. And again, these are medicinal products that were marketed at a certain point in the United States and Germany, for instance. And we all know now the negative, very negative consequences of taking these products. But back then, we did not have the same regulatory framework in place for ensuring that these products were safe before they were introduced in the markets. And one watershed for reform, which led to the current regulatory frameworks we see in multiple countries, was the thalidomide scandal in the 1950s and 1960s. Thalidomide, which was known for its commercial brand Contergan, which was a drug that was taken or recommended initially for dealing with certain complications caused by pregnancy, such as morning sickness, for instance. And the side effects of this medicine, which were identified only at the post-marketing stage, so only after the drug had entered several markets, included congenital malformations, sight and auditive impairment, which led to lifelong negative consequences. And these consequences affected around 100,000 newborns worldwide. And the scandal caused by this drug, caused by the consequences of taking this drug, was such that the regulatory frameworks for ensuring the safety of medicines changed, and the yardsticks, or the threshold that needed to be met, that must be met now for introducing a new medicinal product in a market, is higher than it was when thalidomide entered the market. And here we see, for instance, in the European Union, Directive 2001/83/EC, which provides for the marketing authorization as a requirement for introducing new medicinal products in the European Union. And remember, we are speaking about a common market that the directive tries to regulate. And we also have the possibility to grant conditional marketing authorization in exceptional circumstances. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, fits any definition of exceptional circumstances. And this may lead then to this conditional marketing authorization, which is granted but subject to carrying further studies on the safety of new medicinal products. And the directive also foresees the establishment of a pharmacovigilance system, which will allow for collecting data on potential adverse effects that were not identified initially, that were not identified during the process for obtaining regulatory approval, And in urgent situations, member states may suspend the authorization as a result of the evaluation of this pharmacovigilance system, while notifying all the interested parties like pharmaceutical manufacturers and European institutions. And these urgent situations, of course, may consist of identifying a series of serious adverse reactions to the use of a medicinal product that were not identified during the regulatory approval procedure. We also have in the European Union Regulation 726 of 2004, which established the European Medicines Agency as a specialized agency in the case of medicinal products introduced in the common market. And the regulation also conditions the marketing authorization of these medicinal products to yielding data on their safety and efficacy through clinical trials. And clinical trials must be conducted before these products receive the regulatory approval. And these clinical trials are the ones that may provide the evidence necessary for ensuring, at least to a certain threshold, that these products are safe and effective. And the European Commission, after receiving the opinion of the European Medicines Agency and also of member states, will make the final decision regarding the authorization. So there's the European Commission that authorizes these products, authorizes the entry of these products in the common market. And of course, even though the European Medicines Agency provides a recommendation, in practice, the European Commission has always followed the recommendations of the agency, although in fact it is the Commission, the one with the authority to make such a decision. And here we see the different phases of clinical trials, focusing on the example of vaccines. And we see how different phases deal with different dimensions of different aspects of the safety and effectiveness of medical products, such as vaccines. And the goal is to select a certain number of subjects, of test subjects, persons who will be administered at a certain point the vaccine in order to test to what extent they are safe in their use in humans. And later will be compared with a so-called placebo, that is a solution or a liquid that will resemble the vaccine, but is in fact not the vaccine. And these persons that take this placebo will be compared to those that take the actual vaccine, and this will yield data on how effective the vaccine is actually. And in the third phase and final phase before regulatory approval, the larger groups of subjects are at stake, and the goal is to test the vaccine in quote unquote real world conditions. So not just in an environment where all the several variables are controlled, such as hospitals or clinics, or rather across in a broader context that resembles more day-to-day life. And even after regulatory approval is granted, there is a subsequent phase which relates to the post-marketing oversight of the potential adverse effects that were not identified during the clinical trials in the previous phases of these clinical trials. Because although the output of these clinical trials may consist of establishing the safety to a certain threshold, there is always the possibility that very rare adverse events emerge that could not have were not identified during the phases of clinical trials before the regulatory approval. And The average duration of these trials from the preclinical to the post-marketing phase is between 6 and 8 years, and this is according to data from the United States Food and Drug Administration. So we can see how the duration against the backdrop of an emergency such as the COVID-19 pandemic might not be a sustainable one for such a pressure to come up with a safe and effective vaccine in order to stop the spread of such a deadly disease. And the safety of vaccines may then lead to issues of liability for manufacturers in case they cause damages to individuals. And this is usually falls within the area of tort law, civil law, which will vary, of course, across jurisdictions, whether it's the common law or civil law tradition. But at the level of the European Union, we have Directive 85/374 concerning liability for defective products. And the directive, broadly speaking, states that producers shall be liable for damages caused by defects in their products. So this is harmonized throughout the European Union because both this directive as well as the other two acts that we saw, the regulation and the directive regarding the safety of medicinal products, have been adopted on the basis of the regulation of the common market. And on the basis of the current Article 114 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, these standards are now harmonized, so producers will be liable. However, the injured person is required to prove the damage in judicial proceedings, for instance, and proving particularly that there is a causal relationship between defect and damage. So the injured person, in this case the plaintiff or claimant, must provide evidence on the fact that there is a damage, that there's a defect in the product, which can be the fact that a vaccine does not provide the safety that one would expect it to provide, and that there is a causal relationship between both. And lastly, the directive also stipulates that manufacturers will not be liable if they prove that, quote unquote, the state of scientific and technical knowledge when a product enters the market did not allow the defect to be discovered. And I will come back to this term, state of scientific and technical knowledge, when we look at how the vaccines against COVID-19 were approved, would receive the regulatory approval required for their use in the population. This directive, the directive dealing with liability for defective products, was at stake in the ECJ case, C621 of 15, also known as W and others versus Sanofi Aventis and others. And the facts of the case consist of the following, and in very summarized terms. In 1998, Mr. W took the hepatitis B vaccination produced by Sanofi Pasteur in France, and 2 years later, Mr. W was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and there was no family precedent of the disease. So we have, on the one hand, the use of a vaccine, and on the other hand, we have a serious health event, particularly the emergence of multiple sclerosis. So in 2006, Mr. W and his family filed a lawsuit against Sanofi Aventis and others, claiming liability for the damages caused by the vaccine. And in line with the directive that we just saw, Mr. W and his family were required to prove such a causal link between taking the vaccine and this serious health event. Sadly, Mr. W's physical condition continued to decline due to the deteriorating disease until he passed away on the 30th of October 2011. Now, the ECJ case, which came as a result of a preliminary reference requested by the Cour de Cassation in France, led to a ruling where the ECJ affirmed the directive's obligation of not shifting the burden of proof to the manufacturer. And this, of course, left the challenge of establishing causation in judicial proceedings on the link between a defective product, which can be in this case a vaccine against hepatitis B, and damage caused by such a vaccine to a person individually. And this causation will require medical evidence, of course, but we can imagine why it would be extremely expensive to expect the claimants or plaintiffs to conduct clinical trials to the same scale as the ones required for the regulatory approval of these medicinal products. And moreover, considering the duration of these clinical trials, it would be too prohibitive if it was required for them, for all these claimants and plaintiffs, to demonstrate with the same threshold that there is a causal link between the use of the vaccine on the one hand and the damage on the other hand. And we find a distinction here between correlation and causation, a distinction that is well known in scientific research and, for instance, medical research, since both terms are strictly distinguished. However, in judicial proceedings, we find that judges often resort to the concept of probable causation. So causation is not understood in judicial proceedings in the same way as they are in scientific research and medical research, but rather it is understood as a threshold that whoever has the burden of proof must meet in order to demonstrate, or with a sufficient degree of evidence, that there is such a probable causation. So, long story short, or in very summarized terms, the evidence requested or the evidence required to demonstrate such probable causation must not be or must not reach the same threshold of certainty as the one provided in medical research, for instance, for obtaining the regulatory approval of the new medicinal products. And here we see that during the COVID-19 pandemic, although we have the ordinary regulatory approval procedure that we see visualized in this image taken from the European Medicines Agency, manufacturers seeking to obtain the regulatory approval of a new medical product must undertake all of these steps before, in the case of vaccines, they become available for use in the population. And the aim of all of these steps is to ensure that they are safe, effective, and that they are of quality. And only after all these steps are undertaken will the vaccine become available for use. And let's remember that the average time frame for this whole procedure is between 6 and 8 years. But during COVID-19, and given that we are facing an emergency under all possible understandings of emergency, we see on the right that the vaccine became available for use sooner than it would under the normal, quote unquote, regulatory procedures. So shortly after, clinical trials were conducted, and clinical trials must always be conducted in these two models. Only then did they become available. But of course, this was in the middle of the large-scale production and in the middle of the studies after authorization, since there might be future evidence that emerges once the vaccine is distributed through millions of persons. And this evidence might identify problems that were not detected during the regulatory approval procedure, also due to the fact that the procedure was accelerated in comparison to the quote unquote ordinary ones. And in the case of COVID-19, the vaccines were authorized as fast as 10 months, starting from the moment in which the laboratory research started until they became available for use. So this is a record speed with which such a medicinal product is authorized. But this, of course, entails a series of risks. Then please keep in mind, this is all data taken from the European Medicines Agency. And now moving to the link between vaccine safety and liability in the context of public health emergencies. In the European Union, particularly, all of the vaccines against COVID-19 that have been authorized so far were granted conditional marketing authorization. We mentioned this previously, and this conditional authorization is subjected to further studies in order to ascertain to what extent they're safe and effective. And so far, as of today, the 3rd of April of 2021, there have been 4 vaccines authorized in the European Union by the European Commission after receiving the recommendation by the European Medicines Agency. And how is liability, or how does liability operate in this context of an emergency and of accelerated regulatory approval procedures? Since these vaccines have not followed the ordinary mechanisms, the usual rules on civil liability for potential damages do not apply. And let us remember Directive 85/374, because if the procedure for ensuring safety of the vaccines is accelerated, it does mean a higher risk of undetected adverse events. But given the time pressure that we all experience, and particularly authorities experience, in order to distribute vaccines against COVID-19 as fast as possible in order to protect the population and also to move away from the highly restrictive social distancing measures. So we can imagine why, even though there is a higher risk of undetected adverse events, these risks will be accepted through decisions taken by public authorities in light of the interest to have these vaccines available as fast as possible. So what happens in case vaccines cause adverse events that are not identified during clinical trials? What happens in terms of liability? And we come now to the clauses found in so-called advanced purchase agreements, which are private law contracts that were signed between, on one hand, the European Commission, in the case of the European Union, and on the other hand, pharmaceutical manufacturers for the procurement and then later the distribution of these vaccines across the member states of the European Union. So these private law agreements, and then the one signed between the European Commission and AstraZeneca, these agreements foresee a waiver of liability by the Commission and by EU member states against the pharmaceutical company for the safety and efficacy of vaccines. So in other words, neither the Commission nor the member states may sue pharmaceutical companies on these grounds. They may not hold pharmaceutical companies liable in case future evidence emerges regarding this safety and efficacy, and particularly the fact that they may cause adverse reactions in some patients or individuals that accept taking the vaccine. So that neither the Commission nor the member states may sue these companies on these grounds. However, the waiver is not an absolute one. There are some exceptions in which either the European Commission or EU member states may sue pharmaceutical companies, but these exceptions are redacted from the publicly available versions of the agreements. And I refer to clause 15.1 of the agreement between AstraZeneca and the European Commission as an example of liability clauses in these private law agreements. But what about individuals that develop these serious adverse reactions to vaccines? So although these agreements were signed between the European Commission and pharmaceutical manufacturers, and the European Commission had the power, the legal power under EU law to bind member states, we still have, on the other hand, the case of those persons, individuals who develop the adverse reactions to vaccines. So since they are not parties to these agreements, it would have been against the sense of the directive on the safety of medicinal products to prevent these persons from having access to certain claims of liability. These individuals that may experience serious adverse reactions to the vaccines may indeed file lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies. However, the advanced purchase agreements, the same private law agreements I've been referring to, foresee indemnity clauses. And these clauses, which were designed in order to deal with the risk of future lawsuits, were requested by pharmaceutical companies insofar as, since the regulatory approval procedure was accelerated in comparison to the ordinary ones, pharmaceutical companies wanted the assurance by the European Commission and in extension by member states that they would be indemnified in case of persons filing lawsuits for liability. So they will be compensated in case that these lawsuits are successful for the costs that derive from them. And those individuals that may file lawsuits are referred to as third parties in these agreements because, of course, they did not participate in the signature and in the closure of these agreements. There are exceptions to these indemnifications. So there are cases in which pharmaceutical companies will not be compensated in case there are lawsuits against them. But these hypotheses, these cases, are also redacted. So we do not know, at least in the publicly available versions of these agreements, in which cases pharmaceutical companies will have to cover the cost of those lawsuits. But there are such cases. To conclude, after what we have seen and after my presentation, I will only reaffirm the fact that the regulatory approval of vaccines against COVID-19 entailed a risk-benefit calculus on the potential harm to the health of certain persons that might be caused by these medicinal products. And this will happen in very rare cases, but it is possible that such damages occur. But there is a risk-benefit analysis insofar as society has, of course, an interest in access to these, in gaining access to these products as quickly as possible in order to protect themselves from the spread of COVID-19. And civil liability for potential damages, although it is derived from private law and it is based on private law, is largely determined by the overarching public law framework, the framework designed to ensure that these products are safe and effective, at least up to a certain threshold, because 100% certainty cannot always be guaranteed, even after conducting a series of clinical trials. So this is indeed the risk that is accepted through such decisions by public authorities to move forward with vaccination campaigns, even in the face of insufficient or scientific evidence that may not guarantee 100% that they will be safe and effective in all cases. And beyond liability, we can also keep in mind that although the World Health Organization and the European Medicines Agency and several other institutions, international and national ones, have ascertained that the AstraZeneca vaccine is safe, we can also consider how these developments and these events and the decisions to suspend use of the vaccine temporarily may have an impact on public confidence in the vaccine. We cannot disregard the fact that this dimension is very relevant for the effectiveness and for the acceptance of the vaccination campaigns that are currently undertaking throughout the world to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to thank you for your attention, and until next time.